All right, picture this, a world held hostage by two giants, the United States and the Soviet Union. I mean, each of them had the power to literally end civilization with just the push of a button. So they're locked in this bitter global struggle, right? A Cold War, and it's all defined by one terrifying rule. They could never, ever fight each other directly.
So how do you win a war when actually fighting it means destroying, well, everything? That was the central, terrifying paradox of the entire Cold War. It forced both sides to get creative, to find new, indirect ways to fight for influence. And their solution? It would end up defining the next 50 years and draw battle lines all across the globe.
So here's what we're going to cover. First, we'll set the stage, this world divided in two. Then we're diving into three critical conflicts. The first major hot war in Korea, the moment we all held our breath over Cuba, and the long, drawn-out fight in Vietnam. And finally, we'll connect the dots and see how this high-stakes game still affects us today.
Okay, let's jump right in. After World War II, the world was basically in rubble. The old order was just gone. And from those ashes, a new one was rising, split right down the middle by what Churchill famously called an Iron Curtain. The world had become a giant chessboard, with two opposing camps led by two superpowers. The stage was set for decades of tension.
So how did they solve that big paradox we talked about? How do you fight an enemy you can't touch? The answer is, you get someone else to do the fighting for you. This is the whole idea of a proxy war. Instead of the US and the USSR going head-to-head and risking nuclear Armageddon, they would back opposing sides in smaller, local conflicts all over the world. It was their way of fighting without actually fighting.
And this whole strategy was held together by a massive global web of alliances. The US went on a building spree, creating networks like NATO in Europe, CETO in Southeast Asia, and CENTO in the Middle East, all designed to create this wall of containment around Soviet influence. And of course, the Soviets responded in kind, forging their own network of allies. It basically locked the two sides into this worldwide standoff.
And it didn't take long for this new reality to be put to the test. The first major trial by fire happened on a small peninsula in East Asia. We're talking, of course, about the Korean War, the first real hot war of the Cold War era. So here's the quick backstory. After World War II, Korea, which had been under Japanese control, was split right in half, right along this line of latitude, the 38th parallel. The Soviets backed a communist government up north, and the US supported an anti-communist government down south. The idea was to reunify them eventually, but, well, that never happened. And then, on June 25, 1950, everything exploded. North Korean troops poured across the parallel. Now, for President Truman and the West, this wasn't just some regional conflict or a civil war. No way. They saw it as a clear act of global communist aggression masterminded by Moscow. This quote from Truman really shows you exactly how they viewed it, as a direct challenge that absolutely had to be met.
So the United States, with the UN's blessing, jumped in. And at first, they were incredibly successful, pushing the North Koreans all the way back almost to the Chinese border. But that's when things took a huge turn. China, fearing an American army right on its doorstep, sent hundreds of thousands of troops flooding into the fight. The UN forces were completely overwhelmed, pushed all the way back down the peninsula, and the war ground to a brutal, bloody halt. Pretty much right back where it all started.
After 3 long years of fighting, an armistice was finally signed. Now get this, it wasn't a peace treaty. It was just a ceasefire, one that technically is still in effect today. The 38th parallel became the border again, and for the US, this was chalked up as a win. See, they hadn't destroyed communism in the north, but they had stopped it from spreading. They had contained it, and that set a huge precedent. The idea that American military force could halt the spread of communism, that would become the bedrock of US foreign policy for decades.
So, if Korea set the precedent, our next conflict is where the stakes got raised to the absolute max. This was the single most dangerous moment of the entire Cold War, when a tiny island just 90 miles from Florida brought the world closer to nuclear war than it has ever been before or since.
And man, did this escalate fast. In '59, Fidel Castro comes to power. The US tries to oust him with the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion in '61, which, totally backfired. It just pushed Castro straight into the arms of the Soviets. And that's when the Soviets made their big move. They secretly put nuclear missiles in Cuba, missiles that could strike almost any major city in the United States. When American spy planes found them in October of '62, the world literally held its breath for 13 terrifying days.
This political cartoon from the time just nails the power dynamic perfectly. You've got the Soviet leader Khrushchev as the dentist, and he's yanking these missile teeth out of a very unhappy-looking Fidel Castro. And the caption, "This hurts me more than it hurts you," is just perfect. It shows you exactly what was going on. This was a deal between the two big guys, and smaller countries like Cuba, they were pretty much just pawns on the board, whether they liked it or not.
So, what did President Kennedy do? Instead of an immediate invasion, he chose a naval quarantine, basically a blockade, around Cuba. It created this unbelievably tense standoff at sea, but crucially, it bought both sides time to talk. And in the end, they cut a deal. The Soviets agreed to publicly pull the missiles out, and in exchange, the U.S. promised it would never invade Cuba. But there was also a secret part of the deal. The U.S. also agreed to quietly remove its own missiles from Turkey. The whole thing scared both sides so badly that they installed a direct hotline between the White House and the Kremlin, just to make sure a simple miscommunication couldn't accidentally trigger the end of the world.
You can really draw a straight line from the lessons of Korea and the sheer terror of Cuba to the next major conflict. This one would be a long, brutal, and deeply divisive war. A war driven by a powerful idea that would, in the end, show everyone the very real limits of a superpower's might. So what was that big idea? It all came down to a single, powerful metaphor: the domino theory. The thinking went like this: if one country in a region falls to communism, the one next to it will fall, and then the next, just like a line of dominoes. And this wasn't just some casual theory. For American policymakers, it was an article of faith. They truly believed that if South Vietnam fell, it was inevitable that all of Southeast Asia would follow. But the U.S. didn't just jump into a full-blown war overnight. It was more like a slow slide. First, France failed to hold on to Vietnam as a colony. Then the country was temporarily divided, a lot like Korea. The U.S. stepped in to prop up the anti-communist government in the South. But by 1965, it was clear South Vietnam was about to collapse. That's when President Lyndon Johnson made the fateful call to send in hundreds of thousands of American combat troops. Now, here's where Vietnam was totally different from Korea. This war sparked a huge anti-war movement back in the States. We're talking massive protests on college campuses, people burning their draft cards and acts of civil disobedience. And it wasn't just students. You had major public figures like Martin Luther King Jr. speaking out, and even organizations of veterans who had actually fought in Vietnam coming home and protesting the war. And here's the thing, despite having the most powerful military in the world, the United States just could not get a clear win. So in 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, which basically gave America a way to pull its troops out. But the peace was fragile, and it didn't last. Only 2 years later, North Vietnam launched one last major offensive and finally reunited the entire country under communist rule. And what was the ultimate lesson here? Well, those dominoes, they never fell. The big cascade of communism across Southeast Asia just didn't happen. And why not? Because the domino theory itself was flawed. It saw a war for national independence and mistook it for a simple chess move by Moscow. Turns out, Vietnamese nationalism was a much more powerful force than loyalty to some distant communist power. And maybe most importantly, Vietnam proved to the world and to America itself that there are very real limits to what a superpower can do. All right, so we've looked at Korea, Cuba, and Vietnam. 3 very different conflicts. So what's the big takeaway? How did these proxy wars end up reshaping the entire world? This chart really helps break it down. Just look at how the American justification evolved over time. In Korea, it was all about containment. In Cuba, it was the much more immediate threat to national security. And by Vietnam, it was this abstract domino theory. Each reason led to a different type of superpower action, and each one had a completely different outcome. You can see how the superpowers were learning hard, often brutal lessons with each new conflict. So really, these weren't just a bunch of separate wars. Think of them more like chapters in a single unwritten rulebook for superpower conflict. The stalemate in Korea taught them about limits. The Cuban crisis taught them how to de-escalate from the brink and led to the hotline. And Vietnam delivered a harsh lesson about the limits of power. Together, these conflicts set the deadly rules of the game for the rest of the Cold War. And honestly, the echoes of those rules can still be felt today.
The Cold War might be over, but that playbook, the one about using proxies to fight your battles, that's not gathering dust on a shelf. Which leaves us with one final and I think pretty crucial question to think about. What are the proxy conflicts that are shaping our world right now?